Distinguished Teaching Award and the Lindback Award for Teaching Excellence. Dr. Smith attended Georgetown University and Catholic University, where he earned his bachelor's and master's degrees respectively. He earned his doctorate from the Department of Government and International Relations at the University of Notre Dame. He is the author of Revaluing Ethics, Aristotle's Dialectical Pedagogy, and his scholarly articles on politics, literature, and philosophy have appeared in such journals as American Political Science Review, Review of Politics, Religion and Literature, Polis, Polity, and the Journal of Politics. His research interests have included such topics as classical political theory, politics and religion, and literature and politics. Dr. Smith is currently writing a book defending the natural integrity of political life from a Christian perspective. He lives in Media, Pennsylvania with his wife and 3 children. Tonight's Faith and Reason lecture is entitled Political Ambition and the Desire for Glory. Please help me warmly welcome Dr. Thomas Smith.
Well, thanks. Thanks to Anne-Marie, and thanks to all of you for coming. Welcome. How many humanities majors are here? How many senior humanities majors? This is just an amazingly good class. I was out to dinner with Dr. Schiffman today, and we were talking about what a great class this is and how much we're going to miss you guys. So thanks especially to Anne-Marie, but thanks to everybody for being here. Well, I have to admit, you know, my poor wife, she's a child psychologist, and she's married to this sort of abstract thinker, despite her very applied mind. And before I give a lecture, I inflict it on my wife. So she's heard me give, I don't know how many lectures, and last night I gave this lecture to my wife. She fell asleep in 6 minutes. 6 minutes. It was a new record. I mean, she often falls asleep when I speak. She's never fallen asleep within 6 minutes of me opening my mouth. So I was really hoping nobody was going to show up. But this is a real pleasure. It's a delight to be among friends. I sorely miss the humanities department in my new position, but it's great to know that the good work that the faculty that we've hired continues. And what I'd like to do is start with a YouTube video of President Obama. He was then President-elect Obama, and he made an appearance on Jon Stewart, one of many appearances that he made on Jon Stewart. I think this is October 28th. Okay?
Really, you're an angry, bitter group in this audience, but it's up to them.
It's not very funny cooperation.
No, that's nice. Is there a sense that you have, 2 years ago when you began this journey, the country was not necessarily in the shape it's in now. Is there a sense that you don't want this? That you may look at the country and think, when I thought I was going to get this, it was a relatively new car. Now look at it.
Yeah, I actually think this is the time to want to be president. If you went into public service thinking that you could have an impact, now is the time where you can have an impact. We tend to be a pretty conservative country. I don't mean conservative politically per se, but conservative in the sense that things are kind of going along pretty well, and we don't want to mess with it too much. And then every once in a while, you have these big challenges and big problems, and it gives an opportunity for us to really move in a new direction. I think this is one of those moments on things like energy and healthcare and the economy and education, where I think people recognize, what we've been doing isn't working, and that means that I think people are going to be more open to change.
Well, sir, we definitely appreciate you being on the program tonight. We know what a long haul it's been. You've certainly run a remarkable and historic race, and I have great admiration.
Okay. Here's what I want you to think about. One of the things that's interesting to me about this exchange is how political ambition is somehow both attractive and unattractive at the same time in this exchange, right? So on the one hand, we understand Stewart's question. right? Who would want to be president under these circumstances? You have 2 wars, you have a massive economic crisis, you have partisan bickering. Washington, by all accounts, is broken. The approval rating for Congress stands at something like 15 or 20%, depending on who you ask. So why would you want to do this? By the same token, sort of expanding that, why would you want to do any of those jobs, right? And not just under current circumstances, but under any circumstances. The life of a politician is 24/7. You're constantly going to campaign events. You have rubber chicken dinners on your slate. You're constantly asking for money. And your opponents in the press are digging into your personal and your private life. For most people, a private life is a happier life, right? And let's sort of prove that. How many people here, of the, let's say, 80 or so people here, how many people here really want to be actively engaged in politics when they grow up? We have 4, so 4%. And I was hoping Will was going to be here, because I thought of Will the entire time I was writing this lecture, actually. So I'm going to speak directly to you almost the whole time. So there you go. You have this statistic, which is really amazing. 80% of colleges in the United States accept 80% of the applicants. Right? 80% of the colleges in the United States accept 80% of the applicants. Last year, we had 16,000 applicants for 1,500 spots. Right? So this is an incredibly select group, especially compared to the normal ways that people come to college, right? And of this talented, bright, ambitious group, something like 4% are thinking about a career in public service. So that's on the one hand, right? Political ambition turns us off. On the other hand, we understand President Obama's answer. There's something deeply attractive about being in politics. A couple years ago, Professor Moreland's husband, who teaches in the law school and worked at the White House at the time, got us tickets, insider, some passes somehow, because he worked in the White House, to the West Wing. It was so exciting to be in the West Wing and see the Oval Office and the center of power and where all these decisions are made. In President Obama's case, he thinks there's something compelling about charting a new course for the country in this crisis. So you have this confusion, right? On the one hand, you're attracted to politics, and on the one hand, you think it's awful. But this is the Faith and Reason lecture, and I want to inflect that confusion a little bit by talking about how this problem appears to the audience I have in front of me. Apart from being very bright and ambitious and this sort of select group, this is a group that's also deeply Catholic. Something like 78% of the students at Villanova were brought up Catholic. And the Catholic tradition has this history of service, right? This history of public service. In addition, most of you are struggling with this question that I see over and over and over in private conversations with undergrads. What am I going to do with my life? What is my destiny evoking from me? Life is this sort of open-ended question that's evoking something from my character, that's evoking something from my soul. And what is it that life wants me to do? So I thought the lecture might be useful to typical Villanova undergrads if I asked this question. Should you, as a Christian, be politically ambitious? That's sort of the question. Should you aspire to be actively engaged in politics? If you were so ambitious, would it be good for you? And if you were not, would it be bad for you? Given how few of you are interested in politics, probably I have a very small audience. But this question ought to be compelling even if you're not specifically interested in running for office. Because you have to think about what the relationship is between your responsibilities to your nation and your faith in some broad way. And that's at least around the question I'm asking. So let's start. My talk will have 3 main points. What are the arguments for turning away from political ambition? Okay, that's the first question. What is it that makes us not want to do this stuff? Remember, we started with this observation that we're sort of pushed and pulled in politics. On the one hand, we don't like it, and on the other hand, we like it. So what is it that we don't like about it? The second part is sort of a different, maybe unexpected turn. What is politics anyway? I think in order to understand why you're attracted to it, why you might be interested in it, you might need a fuller, richer understanding of what politics is, at least from a Catholic perspective. And then the third part, which is going to be probably the oddest part to you, is what is the relationship between ambition and the desire for glory? Okay, so first things first. Why don't we like politics? I'm going to say that we don't like politics, or that we're not politically ambitious, because there's a certain way in which the country we live in has privatized ambition. It's not that we're not ambitious. It's that our ambition has a relentlessly private drive. That's the argument. More than any other system of government, our system of government is planned. It was conceived by a set of political philosophers who asked basically the same kind of question. How can we establish a politics based above all on the consent of the governed and directed at safeguarding individual liberties? The most obvious way of resolving this question is to base all political authority on the consent of the governed. So the guiding star of a lot of liberal democratic thought is this notion of a social contract. Society is not natural, it's conventional, it's agreed to on the basis of a contract. People sign on to this contract because they see certain kinds of benefits accruing to themselves if they join it. And the point of the contract, above all, is to safeguard security and individual liberty. This way of conceiving the problem of political power leads you to be deeply suspicious of political power generally and of ambition in particular. Ambitious people tend to use their authority to usurp individual rights and liberties, for example. The way the founders managed this problem of ambition is by, in their words, counteracting ambition with ambition. They don't rely on parchment barriers to keep people in check. What they do is they assume that anybody who's going to inhabit these offices is going to be deeply ambitious, eager for more power, and what you do is you give them the constitutional ability to act on that ambition, and by this mutual interaction of ambition, what you do is limit the power of the government. So in other words, what's to stop an ambitious president from taking over power from a Congress, or an ambitious congressman from taking over power from the court? What's to stop them is the very ambition of the people they're competing with, an ambition that makes them very attracted, very attached to the offices they inhabit. So you would set up a system of mutual interaction whereby this conflict, this competition, keeps people in check. In this way, the internal structure of the government is set up to make sure that ambition counteracts ambition. The effect of this is conflict, gridlock, delay, mutual inaction. The inability of ambitious people to act on their ambition, in effect. This makes sense from the founders' point of view. This is good news from the founders' point of view. Because if you don't trust ambitious people and you want a limited government, the first thing you do is contrive the structure of government so it doesn't do much. Right? So all the things that we complain about government, we actually should celebrate, according to the founders. You could put it this way. Institutionally, we have a system that organizes power to foster powerlessness among the powerful. That's sort of the point. You want to foster powerlessness among the powerful. You want to create a system so that ambitious people have a hard time acting on their ambitions. If you're ambitious, you know you're being managed in this way. You know you're being sort of massaged in this way. And so many people of ambition tend to direct their ambitions towards private careers in the economy, or more rarely in popular culture. This is what I'm calling the privatization of ambition. And it stems from this relentless separation of powers and a fostering of competition among the players in government. So that when you people sit out there and think about your lives and how you want to live your lives, and you think about being able to make real choices to direct your own affairs, what you don't think about is public life. Because that's a ticket to frustration and competition. What you do think about is vice president of a company, or CEO of a company, or director of a major law firm, right? You tend to want to make money, which isn't all bad, because that facilitates this private, comfortable life full of choices. And so you can consume culture and consume resources with the feeling that this is really where freedom is. Now, this accounts, I think, for one deep and paradoxical experience of freedom that we have in our country. On the one hand, we experience ourselves as free, right? We know that we have a lot of choices. We understand that we have a lot of, well, maybe not so much anymore. We have money in our wallets, and we can buy things and make career choices. And so on the one hand, on this sort of private level, we have this experience of freedom. And so America lives up to its promise in a certain way. On the other hand, we also feel like our lives are run by impersonal forces that we're not known to. Impersonal forces that don't know us and that we can't affect, like the market or the federal government or the global economy. And so there's this funny, again, push and pull between the experience of being able to choose and the experience of being utterly at the mercy of these impersonal forces. And I think liberal democracy tends to create this sense. This is why all sorts of people in our country, Christians and non-Christians alike, are led away from public life. It's probably one reason, again, most of you are not attracted to politics. When you think about possible career paths, working really, really, really hard to be frustrated by a system isn't your first choice, right? So that's okay, right? I'm not here beating you up about how you lack public spirit and how it was different in the 60s. Right? This is the way I used to get beat up when I was in college. Americans are led away from public life for these kinds of reasons. There's a lot more to say about that, of course. But instead, I don't want to moralize. Instead of moralizing, let me just ask a series of questions. In the system we've got, people of talent are naturally, almost naturally led away from public life into private concerns. Does the way we handle political ambition make it more difficult to protect our political freedom? Does the way we're managing ambition tend to rob us of the kind of leaders who would make a difference for public life? Does it tend to make us retreat into private economic or cultural pursuits? Will we tend to think of public life as increasingly neutral and hollow? And at the same time, will we also tend to think of private life as the attempt to accumulate more and more choices and more private satisfactions? In other words, will we tend to think of our private lives as also more empty and hollow? If you're uneasy with the answers to those questions, maybe you need to rethink your relationship to public life. Maybe you need to rethink, we all need to rethink the extent to which we want to serve our nation by being more active citizens. And maybe we want to think about those questions not just as good Americans, but as good Christians. Let me put it in less abstract terms. I live in a very wealthy parish. I live in the kind of parish that you probably are going to live in when you're I don't want to say grown up, but old like me. I worship and hang out with people who are very, very successful, very, very ambitious, who have made a lot of money and made their way in the world, as you will when you're my age, which isn't too far off. They have almost no, the people that I hang out with have almost no interest in participating in public affairs. Most have withdrawn from politics almost completely. This is something we should really wonder about if we're Christians. There are good Christian reasons for turning away from a life of politics, right? And the Christian tradition has examples of people like St. Anthony who just need to go away from public life and do something else, even though most of the time they insist they're in solidarity with us in a deeper way. So there are good Christian reasons for withdrawing from public life. But the kind of private ambition I'm talking about probably isn't one of them, right? Being a CEO of a company or major partner in a law firm is not being St. Anthony, going out in the desert, right? But this is precisely the way Christian people of ambition are reacting to the demands of political life, withdrawing more and more and more, which is a funny situation. You're not resolving the problem of ambition. You're not engaging the problem of ambition. In a certain way, you're being utterly conventional about how you're reacting to the problem of ambition, right? You're not engaging that problem in a deeper, richer way. So I want to think about maybe a different objection that you might have to political life, an objection that comes from Machiavelli, or comes as a result of reading Machiavelli, which probably some of you have. And this is a quote from The Prince. He says it's his intention to write a book which will be useful, and he wants to follow the real truths and not the imagination of truths. Many people have pictured republics and principalities which have never been known or seen, people like Augustine in The City of God or Plato in the Republic. Because how one lives is so far distant from how one ought to live, that he who neglects what's done for what ought to be done sooner affects his ruin than his preservations. For a man who wishes to act entirely up to his professions of virtue soon meets with what destroys him among so much that is evil. This is sort of a classic Machiavellian statement about what politics is like. Politics is mostly about human wickedness, it's about power, it's about evil, and you have therefore two choices, right? You can, if you want to participate in politics, you can be wicked and evil like everybody else and play the game of power and try to win it, or you can be some kind of high-minded idealist who wants to be good, right? But the problem is that the good is ineffectual, it doesn't do anything. So the only two choices are you play the game of power, or you are a useless, impractical, hopeless idealist who in the end will be destroyed. If these are your two options when you think about participating in public life, you quickly think of the third option, which is not to participate in public life, right? And so this is a typical response that Christians that I know have to this question of should I participate in public life. I don't want to get my hands dirty, and I don't want to get stabbed in the back, which, you know, these are good impulses, right? And so if I want to avoid those things, the only thing I can do to become pure is refuse to participate in the game in the first place, right? I think this is a more compelling, this is a more ostensibly compelling account for Christians. But I'm going to say that doesn't work either. I'm going to say that doesn't work either. It only works if you buy the terms of the choice as Machiavelli presents them. If you buy the terms of the choice as Machiavelli presents them. If you frame the choice that's available to you in the way that he frames it. And notice, this isn't an argument. It's a series of claims or assertions. It looks like an argument, but it doesn't really appeal to any evidence. There's no internal logic to it. It just says, well, we all know what politics is like, right? We all know what reality is, right? In reality, the good guy gets killed and the bad guy wins, right? Well, if you take the terms of the question as he frames it, you tend to withdraw from politics. But you want to be careful. I think Machiavelli is giving us actually a deeply misleading way of thinking about reality or real politics. And it's important not to give him the last word. He's giving us what you might call in contemporary talk a dysfunctional account of politics. You have dysfunctional accounts of marriage, you have dysfunctional notions of friendship, or abusive emotional relationships. Would you call them real? Would you call them the most real instances of those phenomena? Don't you think the opposite? Don't you think? Well, don't you hear people say, after they've been in an abusive relationship and they find a healthy relationship, don't you find them saying things like, I finally found something real, right? Finally found something real. Don't we want to take the most flourishing example of a phenomena as the most real case, the central case of a phenomena? Isn't the most real marriage the one that flourishes? Isn't the most real friendship the one that enjoys communion? And don't the dysfunctional ones fall away from the best more or less? This is an old point, but it goes to the heart of Catholic thinking about our sociability. The main point here is that traditionally, Catholic political thought makes the distinction between our nature as it happens to be in its untutored state, and our nature as it would be if we reached the full flourishing of all our capacities. The central case, the most real case for thinking about human nature and its perfection in society is the full flourishing of all our capacities in communion with each other. If that's the most real case, we can't buy the terms that Machiavelli uses, or the choice he foists off on us will be the only choice available to us. He'll distort our thinking about the kind of choice that we can make. So I'm going to argue that in order to think well about whether to participate in politics or not, you need some compelling account of what politics looks like, some compelling account of what's attractive about politics. Going back to my original point. What is it that we find so compelling about this? And I'm going to give an account out of my own tradition, out of the tradition I think most of you belong to, out of the Catholic tradition. So in this tradition, what is politics anyway? What is politics anyway? To start thinking about that question, let me make a distinction between politics on the one hand and politicking on the other. And I'll give you an image taken from Plato's Republic to illustrate this distinction. Plato says that politics is like, or being in a political community is like being on a ship. It's like being on a ship that's sailing to port. Okay. And there's a lot of things you have to pay attention to if you are going to get to port safely with your cargo and your crew intact. You have to know the winds, you have to know the tides, you have to know how to sail, you have to know how the rigging works, you have to know how to navigate by the stars, you have to know how to use this thing, right? You got to know all that stuff. And there are some people who understand this, and all they do is worry about those things. They study those things. On the other hand, there are some people who are so eager to steer the ship that all they do is sit around thinking about who's going to steer, and all they do is jockey for position about who's going to steer. And they don't think about the ship as a common project. They think about the ship as a tool that they can use to further their own narrow interests. That's the difference between politicking and politics. The person who thinks about the winds and the stars and the rigging and the steering and the navigation, that's Socrates says, the true politician. The person who thinks about who's up, who's down, who's in, who's out, who's got power, who doesn't have power, that's the person who's trying to steer the ship. Former President Clinton was once asked how he felt when he first took over as president, and he said something like, "I feel like a dog that's just been chasing a garbage truck his whole life, and now I caught it, and I don't know where to drive." That's not Plato. It's the difference between politicking and politics. I've been so busy politicking, he said, that now that I have the ship of state, I don't know where to steer it. Right? It's like being obsessed with making the trains run on time and you don't know where they're going. Right? So, what is politics anyway? What is this ability to steer the ship of state? What is that? In the tradition that I belong to, it insists that politics is natural, not conventional. And so I'm going to have to give some account of the naturalness of politics. You can start to think about it this way. I think my wife fell asleep before this point, but maybe you will too. Human nature is underdetermined. This is one way of thinking about it. Human nature is underdetermined. Animals enact the range of their behaviors through something we call instinct. Dogs bark, salmon swim in particular ways, geese migrate, elephants rear their offspring. Why do they do these things the way they do? I really don't think we know. What we say is, it's instinct. Somehow they do it, and they do it in these regular ways. These species seem to engage in these behaviors without forethought, reflection, or choice, at least as we understand them. Human beings participate in these biological processes because we're animals. Apart from automatic processes like breathing or your fingernails growing, we also engage our nature in a way that's mysteriously different from the way other animals do it. Human behavior is not entirely determined by nature, in other words. We're underdetermined in the way I'm talking about. We're more underdetermined than animals are, or something. We share with animals the need for food and drink, the desire for sex, the need to rear offspring, but nature has not provided us any straightforward instinctual way of meeting these needs. There's, it turns out, a variety of possible ways to eat and to drink and to mate and to raise your children, to get along with one another and to share common resources. And human beings, more than this, don't want to do these things any old way, right? We want to do these things in a way which conduces most to happiness and meaning. In the mainstream Catholic tradition, there's this sort of kind of natural happiness that goes along with the full flourishing of our natural capacities in these ways. We're just joyful when we've met these capacities. So how do we engage these biological urges in a way that's different than animals? One way of thinking about it is that nature has provided us with reason to engage these questions. Reason is not a mental capacity limited to economics or natural science. It turns out that if you're going to be more ambitious about politics, you have to be more ambitious about how you think about human reason. So I'm not going to limit the scope of reason to something like rational choice theory as you get in economics, or the kind of self-conscious reductionism you get in the natural sciences. Those kinds of reasons know important slices of reality, but they don't exhaust the kind of knowledge human beings need to know in order to flourish together. Why not? And this is really an important cultural question that we have to ask ourselves. We're living with a conception of reason, or several conceptions of reason, like a bone in our throat. We can't swallow them and we can't cough them up. We know intuitively that there's something narrow and cramped about the kind of rational choice reason that goes along with economic theory, mainstream economic theory. And we know that there's something not quite sufficient in the kind of reason that the natural sciences exalt. But we can't quite give them up or put them in a larger perspective. So we can't swallow them, we can't cough them up. We're reaching out for a richer, wider field of vision than these disciplines give us. Why? Think about, for example, the 790 billion with a B, stimulus package that was just passed this week in Congress. You have one overriding question when you look at this sausage grinder of a piece of legislation, right? Is it going to work? And in order to know that question, you would need to know a heck of a lot about economics, a heck of a lot more than I know about economics. But don't you want to know something more than that about this bill? What is this bill going to do for the poor and disadvantaged? Is it going to use taxpayer money to reward private greed, or is it going to build up some richer common life? If you want to know something about those things, you have to have a wider field of vision than what economic theory provides. You need to know something comprehensive about what a good society does to cultivate human beings flourishing across this range of things that I'm talking about. And that's a political question. That's not an economic question. Right? It's a political question. And the political question is intimately involved in the question of what is good for us to be and do as a community. Right? Or think about the claim that politics shouldn't decide questions of science. That's clearly untrue. It's clearly untrue. Or at least it depends on what you mean. If you're going to make a good political decision about how to handle the question of whether to fund stem cell research, for example, you absolutely need to know important things about biology, stem cells, right? But the important thing to realize is that the answer to the question of whether you should fund stem cell research doesn't come from science, even though you might need to know science in order to adjudicate that question. The answer to that question comes from politics. Comes from the communal effort to think through the question of what kind of human life do we want to protect, right? What do we do with sickness and suffering? What are the limits of what we can do with sickness and suffering? What kind of things are we going to permit science to do, and what kind of things should we keep it from doing? That's an intensely political question, not a scientific question, right? So I want to argue that the kind of reason that I'm talking about, what this tradition I'm talking about calls practical wisdom, it goes all the way down. It's not something that you do after the necessities of life have been met, where you sort of, like Maslow says, you get the sort of food and drink and shelter that you need, and then you can worry about questions of meaning. The questions of meaning are already apparent in the question of how you are meeting your need for food and drink and shelter. Right? They're not separate from those questions. In order to determine how to have a flourishing human life, human beings, since they're not provided with instinct in the same way human animals are, simply need sustained conversation and common deliberation about the question, what is it for us, what is best for us to be and do? We're the only animals that can speak together about what's just and unjust, right and wrong, advantageous and disadvantageous to us. Practical reason in this sense seeks and enacts meaning in our affairs across a wide range of complex activities. That's what politics is about. Common speech and action directed to reaching out for the human good in the community. I'm not being Pollyannish about this. Clearly, human beings can have very narrow conceptions of what it means to flourish, can have very narrow, cramped, blind conceptions of what's good. But the point is that they're always acting on some determinate notion of what's good when they act. These practical judgments aren't self-evident necessarily. They don't come down to us from on high in law-like rules. They're often difficult to make. They often demand getting a handle on complexity and various kinds of scientific and economic and social knowledge. They require reflection and experience and the development of capacity for mature judgment. But even with those caveats, and even with the caveats about how wrong people can go, how misinformed reason can be, and how much it can be abused, it's important to see that part of the reason we're so turned off by things like narrow partisanship or special interest politics is precisely the ways they are cramped, narrow, self-centered accounts of human flourishing. Right? Now, this is, it's hard to test this, the reaction you're going to have to this, because my wife was asleep during this part of the talk. But if you're a practical bent of mind, you might think this is hopelessly abstract, it's hopelessly philosophical. What does politics have to do with all this stuff about the human good and nature and animals? I would argue that this is not actually abstract and philosophical. I think it's developed. This way of reflecting on politics has developed rather by very close attention to what human beings do when they have to act together politically. Think about the kinds of conversations, the kinds of questions that our political community has faced over its history. What should we sell and what should we prohibit from selling? That's a political question the United States has faced. That was the question at the heart of Civil War. Can you sell a human being? Now, it turns out that politics, for various reasons in that period in American history, broke down, and that question had to be settled by war, which was a failure of politics. But this question of what you have to, what you can sell and what you can't sell is an inherently political question. And it's involved with this question of how we interact, how we exchange goods, and how we exchange our persons with each other, right? It's not abstract, it's not philosophical, it's sort of a lived question, right? Medical technology is making all sorts of amazing discoveries that allow us to prolong life. And so we're asking all sorts of questions that we didn't have to ask before about how to deal with human suffering and how to deal with the end of life. Should we permit people to take their own lives in the face of suffering? That's a political question. I'm not saying you should be ignorant about science when you answer that question, but it's a question the community has to come together and resolve through reasoned speech. Our individual identity is somehow bound up with this question of who we allow into our community and who we don't allow into our community. For years we've been having this debate about immigration, right? Who are we going to allow into the country and who aren't we going to allow into the country? Are we going to be more generous or less generous? The basic boundaries of your community is one of the most basic questions you face, and that's a political question. How are we going to be good to the people who want to come in? Right? How should we educate and rear our children? What sort of things do we want them to see and participate in? What sort of things don't we want them to see and participate in? And on and on and on and on and on. What sort of things do we want to remember as a community? How do we cultivate common identity through celebration of and rituals? These are intensely vexed questions. They're questions that we should expect sharp and biting disagreements about. A healthy political debate is often characterized by these kinds of sharp-pointed disagreements, but that's not a defect, right? That's what politics is. It's human beings who care enough about how to become good together to engage in these sharp-pointed, vexed, difficult conversations together, and then take common action to resolve them. We can think about the work that practical reason has to do in politics in line with analogous activities. Let's say running a household. Most of you sort of at least have some experience of your parents running a household. It's actually pretty complicated to run a household. And it involves day-to-day setting different priorities for the people in the household. How are you going to set financial priorities? How are you going to balance work and home life? How are you going to raise your kids? What kind of time are you going to spend together? Where are you going to take your vacations? How are you going to deal with responsibilities and chores? How are you going to pass on wisdom to your children? In sum, how are you supposed to foster the human good for all the participants in the community, given the talents and needs of the people that you live with? In an analogous way, citizens of a democracy, through their practical intellect, have to sort through a host of difficult questions. So this is why I want to say that politics is a complex, interdependent activity involving rational animals seeking to become more human together through common deliberation and action. In the kind of country we live in a democracy that we live in, citizens are the final arbiters, in a sense, of these human good questions. But it shouldn't be surprising that we welcome political leaders who are ambitious to guide the process that I've just talked about. And this is where political ambition comes into the talk. It's exciting for some people to think about how to lead their fellow citizens through this tangle of questions and come out on the other side with the country better off. This is the sort of psychic spring which animates ambition. It's the desire to put your hand to something that's incredibly complex, extraordinarily interesting, and to manage these various levels of complexity in discrete ways by ordering them in line with a compelling vision that you have. That's really what ambition is, right? And so the sort of capacity of your vision is everything. The sort of range of vision that you have is everything in this. Everything depends on being able to expand the horizons of your reflections in a way that comprehends extraordinarily high degrees of complexity in economics, in society, in science, and all the rest that you have to manage. At the same time as you seek to order this complexity in line with what you think is the good for this community in this time and place. And most societies recognize that some people have an astonishing capacity for this and clear a space for it. Right? This impulse to ambition, therefore, is natural in its own way. Political communities seem to require this kind of vision in order to move forward. It's not the vision of a Platonic guardian. It's not the vision of a sculptor trying to impose order on marble. It's sort of a passive piece of clay. Especially in a democracy, it's much more complicated than that. And therefore, it depends on a host of personal qualities that nature has provided for human beings, like decisiveness, daring, flexibility, intuition, personal skills, virtues of intellect and character. We should mean something like that, right? That brings me to the third and final part of the talk, this relationship between ambition and the desire for glory. This is going to be the weirdest part of the talk. As if the talk wasn't weird enough. And it's going to be weird because I'm going to talk about this ambition stuff in ways that we don't usually talk about. We usually talk about this in terms of management, leadership stuff. I'm not going to talk about it that way. I'm going to use sort of more ancient language because I think it's actually more adequate to what we're trying to think about. It sounds strange to hear, but political ambition is attracted above all to the human good. Machiavelli was wrong, right, when he said that the good is useless and impractical. This is what motivates us. Discrete, particular conceptions of the human good. The good is simply attracted to us, and people of ambition are compelled by it. You can be deeply mistaken about what's good, and you can lead the political community in speech and action in ways that are deficient, but you're still attracted to some idea of good. Because it's deeply attracted to us this way, political ambition has to be understood as an erotic desire for glory. It arises out of the same part of the soul that the longing for beauty arises out of. Glory is a shining forth of goodness in a way that's publicly celebrated. It's a communication of excellence in a way that people recognize and laud. This is why I want to say it's in the same field of beauty. It's not beauty, but it's in the same field. Beauty is clearly different in important ways from glory. Beauty is generally applied to the sense, particularly to sight. But there's also a kind of beauty that inheres in institutions, in practices, and actions, something like moral beauty. And when people's actions and characters are good in this profound way, these phenomena shine forth in a way that's attractive to us. I think that makes intuitive sense, actually. When we hear parents we overhear parents saying things to kids like, "That was an ugly thing you did when you hit your brother," right? Or we also feel compelled when we witness an act of generosity or kindness or honesty. "That was a beautiful thing you did." We use this kind of language, right? And it speaks about this sort of connection between beauty and goodness, and the hinge here between beauty and goodness, I'm saying, is a kind of affection or a kind of love. We just have this thirst for glory, and it's pretty simple. It's pretty clear why. We want to live lives that shine forth in goodness. Life is not a work of art. I'm not saying that we're engaged in some aesthetic project when we do this. The point isn't to make ourselves more attractive in a certain way. It's to make ourselves good and to have this goodness shine forth. That's a reiteration of some very old thinking about the transcendentals, which I won't go into. But basically, the claim is that the good and the beauty are convertible. The good and the beautiful are convertible. They're the same way. They're the same reality. Ultimately, it's just different. You have different ways of thinking about them or perceiving them. So the desire for glory, the desire for political ambition, is erotic. It's erotic. I'm not talking about the Obama girl. I'm talking about this part of the soul, this impulsive desire that's often equated with sexual love, but it's not limited to sexual love. Erotic desire is a passionate desire that longs for completion in acts that allow us to transcend ourselves, and often generate something outside of ourselves. This is why sex is the usual way of thinking about eros. It reaches out toward a beloved and the fecundity of children, and therefore a wider group. In this sense, it's inherently generative and desirous. We can't understand what's generous about political ambition without knowing something about this erotic desire for glory. If we are attracted to political life, it's often out of that impulse. So political ambition, especially if it longs for something really great, is born from this desire to serve in a way that will help people flourish. At the same time, we can't understand how political ambition goes wrong without understanding it as the erotic desire for glory. Augustine says that the desire for glory, if you're not careful, leads down a slippery slope towards love of domination. People we know who are ambitious can be so enamored of their own vision that they engage in power to achieve it. They can be so in love with the idea of appearing great and good that they manipulate and deceive to get that impression. So if you're a Christian, going back to my first question, and you're going into political life, if you think that politics is something compelling, the question you have to ask yourself consistently is, can I struggle well with the temptation to political glory? Can I consistently relate my desire for glory to God's own glory? Can I see the ways I'm prone to egotistical glory that closes in on the self and seeks power rather than generous self-giving love? Those are hard questions to answer and ask. Political ambition has something to do with wanting to be recognized and celebrated as good. There's nothing wrong with that. Just like there's nothing wrong with your kids, when you have kids, your kids' face lighting up when you say, "Good boy." People want that. There's nothing wrong with that. The problem is that when you go into the realm of politics, there's so much smoke and mirrors going on that you're almost inevitably deceived about whether you're actually good or not. So the question is whether you have the humility to seek the good and truth and try to determine what the real matter is between what people say about you or think about you and what the real case is. The point is that the only way of transforming the desire for political ambition is to see it as part of a much deeper and much larger longing. It's amazing to think in this regard how many times Christ says in the gospel he's offering us glory. This is a central part of the promise of the Christian life. It looks like we simply want a felicitous communion in which each one of us will be known and loved as we are known and loved by a good and loving God and by each other. This is what we're promised. That recognition of what we ultimately want, I think, can heal vision and can heal selfishness and the desire for domination that Augustine talks about. But so here's where I'll end. Understanding political ambition, understanding why Christians might have a motive for engaging in public life, entails having a more ambitious understanding of human being, a more ambitious understanding of reason, and a more ambitious understanding of your own ambitions. Thanks. Happy to take questions or comments or anything. Yeah, Jean.
Could you name one of your political heroes and tell us a little bit about how this person might have navigated the question of ambition well?
Well, this is a really boring answer, but I'll say it anyway. Lincoln is just sort of the person for me who understood how to manage ambition. One of his early biographies, Herndon, said his ambition was a little engine that knew no rest. He was just amazingly ambitious.
And to what end?
Well, he just wanted political office. He wanted to be a state representative, he wanted to be a senator, and he ultimately wanted to be president. He worked very, 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 very hard at this. And he was actually a pretty good politician, like Doris Kearns Goodwin's book proves. The interesting thing about Lincoln in this regard, I think, is he had this melancholy about him, this depressive element of his character, which went along with this ambition. And as the Civil War progressed, and he was sort of flayed alive by public opinion, and got exactly the opposite of the kind of glory that I think he was seeking. He encountered a much sort of more tragic understanding of the war and his own political career, and that, I think, in the end, healed him of the bad form of ambition. And so it's sort of sobering to think that that healing comes with suffering. Peter had his hand up first.
How big would you encourage us to be in our ambition? The way you described it at the very beginning was, it sounded like the whole system was set against us. Got the Constitution even, got these founders organizing everything ahead of time, so that when we try to be ambitious, and thinking in a good way, we find ourselves shoved into failure, frustration, gridlock, and the pettier sorts of ambition.
Right.
So how big should we think? Is this the start of a revolution?
Should be just as ambitious as you should be. I mean, you know, I guess maybe this is time for personal confession. When I was 14, I wanted to be a senator and marry Brooke Shields. That was my ideal life. I was cured of that in a sense by reading Plato's Republic and Augustine and sort of falling in love with wisdom and saying the ways in which if I wanted to accomplish the things I wanted to accomplish, I had to become wise, and I was brought face to face with my own lack of wisdom, and that in a sense cured me of my ambition. And I married somebody much better than Brooke Shields anyway. But if you're cured of that kind of pretension, which was really smoke and mirrors, ambition could be just serving really well on your zoning board. You know, I went to my uncle's funeral a couple years ago, and he was a pillar of his community. He was on the zoning board for his little town up in upstate New York for 20 years. And person after person after person came up to me at his casket and said, "Your uncle made this town 1,000,000 times better with his service." That's a good life. It's a really good life. I mean, ambition doesn't have to tend to revolution. It could just tend to the patient, humble work of tending to the people in front of your face. As long as you don't have this sort of smoke and mirrors account of what you're supposed to be about. I think Jonathan had his.
Yeah, just a question, Tom. I'm not exactly sure how to articulate it, but it seems that, if I understood you correctly, what you're restructuring here kind of hinges on is this notion of exactly what's possible and your conception of what's possible. And since you did invoke Augustine, I guess I'd like to ask a question from where I understand you maybe parting a little bit from Augustine. In the sense that I think part of what made Augustine a little bit pessimistic, or a lot pessimistic about what was possible, was exactly the means by which we can access the good that we, or through grace, that's going to actually recalibrate our vision for the good. How would you explain today how the means by which you see that access to the vision of the good available to everybody? Does that make sense?
I'm not sure. How do we get access to the good?
Why you're more sanguine about this prospect of being able to share the vision of the good, because you did admit it very obviously in form that it's very possibly wrong about what you want.
Sure.
So how can it be combined in a diverse and broad and...
Well, I'm not sure there's any access to the good apart from this slow, patient work of talking together and acting together in search of the good. I mean, that's part of the trick. It's not like the kind of political wisdom that we need is somehow available to us in tablets, and we just have to download it. It's a question of you and me and everybody in a democracy sitting down and saying, okay. Here's a really hard question. Those people want to get married. And our tradition, many people's traditions, says they can't. How do you work through that question together? I don't see any alternative in politics except to engage in sort of different and often rival claims about what a good marriage looks like. That's how you get access to the good, and it proceeds in fits and starts, and you are mistaken about it, and reason could be misinformed and deformed. You know, here's a person who might be helped by stem cell research, although I think the claims made for stem cell research are too big. Do we permit this kind of research to happen, even if it proceeds on the basis of aborted fetuses? That's a question the community has to sort of wander through together. I mean, that's sort of what politics is. So I don't know whether I'm sanguine about it. I see political debates go wrong all the time. I just don't see what the alternative is. I mean, the alternative that you seem to be presenting me with is some other access to the good. But what I'm saying is, in terms of politics, there is no other access to the good.
Well, it's really more about the breadth of the vision of common grace for this enterprise. How would you, other than just asserting it as it must be out there, I'm not...
Well, sometimes you learn by failure, right? Sometimes you learn by failure. You know, going back to Lincoln, the access to the good that he seemed to have at the end of the Civil War came out of this sort of cauldron of failure. And saying, because the way we've treated these people has led to this impasse, we know that we can't do that anymore. Right? Because we've enacted injustice in these particular ways economically, we know we can't do that anymore.